let's begin more or less chronologically. You came here in 1978, and when you came here in 78 with Nelson, did you imagine that this would be your career, or did you think of what you were doing in admissions as sort of a brief detour from practice?
I don't think I even thought of it that concretely. We came, as you know, for his job, and I was a lawyer, and I was eager to leave LA, so I was figuring there were any number of things I could do here, including take the New York bar and hang out a shingle. That was kind of as concrete as my thinking had gotten. And while we were here, because Roger Crampton, who was the dean, insisted that this lawyer spouse should show up for the interview, I think I had the impression it was somewhat of an unusual thing for the law school to be worried about what would a candidate's spouse be doing. So while I was here, he informed me that there were actually 3 openings for lawyers on the law school staff. One was a legal aid position, working with Barry Strom, and one was a brand new director of development position, and then there was the dean of admission position. And I went down and talked to Barry Strom, and his description of what the job was sounded like a public defender position without the excitement of the trials. So I expressed no interest in that. Development I had no knowledge of, but instinctively knew that fundraising probably wouldn't be my forte. On admissions, I figured, what the heck? I'll throw my hat into that ring. And I wasn't the school's first choice. They offered the job to someone else first, which actually was a great relief to me when they did offer it to me. As a spouse, I figured it meant they were being selective, and that I probably had some attributes that would make me decent at that. But I really had no idea what it was. And I think you may have heard me tell the story about how for the first year or two, especially in the fall, recruiting in little colleges in New England, driving around, talking to small groups of students, staying in little inns, eating good meals. I was like, I can't believe they're paying me to do this. Because as a public defender in LA, which was my only other professional job experience, we had no idea there were people being paid for that kind of work. As we, sat in jails interviewing desperate clients, and so I really just wasn't thinking concretely enough to wonder.
As you scrambled up the learning curve of this brand new job, did you get much support from colleagues at other institutions who are doing similar work, other people at Cornell? You also had as a mentor here within the law school, Norm Penny, to whom you did a shout out in your advisory council.
Yes.
Could you talk about these various sources
I
of
did.
guidance?
I got support from both several faculty here, and Roger was very, people are surprised to hear it now, I think, but he was extremely supportive of me. I think he was proud of having hired a woman for this position, and so he was really not at all an impediment to my feeling good about the job. But Norm was instrumental. In fact, I don't think I could have done a good job and then grown into the career I had he not been here, because he knew so much about law admission, having been on the original law school admission council board.
Could you talk a bit more about that, because I don't have anybody sort of talking about Norm and his role within the school and in the admissions.
Sure. Well, he was chairman of the admissions committee the year I was hired, and I had the impression that the admissions committee was very involved in the selection, although actually I was hired by the dean. As soon as I took the job, he sort of came in and really took me under his wing, taught me incredible amounts about law school admission, particularly about the LSAT. But most significantly, he took me that fall to a meeting that was held that year at Columbia of what was called the Gang of Nine. And it was the top 9 private law schools in the country and their admissions deans. And back then, some of the schools were still operating with a law faculty member as the admissions dean, but several of them had moved away and had hired a professional dean of admissions, non-faculty. But it was a wonderful group. It was more than 9 people. It was 9 schools, maybe 14 or 15 people. And we met, and it was a built-in support group. A couple of the people I bonded with very quickly. One became one of my very best friends in life, Jim Milligan, who was the dean of admissions at Columbia Law School. So whenever we encountered whenever I encountered problems or things going on that I was confused about, just picked up the phone and called those people. But for the 3 years that Norm was here, when I was here, he was very accessible. I think he chaired the committee all 3 of those years, just it probably took him those 3 years to share everything he knew about admission.
And was he at that time also still very active in law school admission council work?
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, probably if an outsider had been viewing it, there was probably a little cohort of maybe 6 or 7 male faculty members who continued to really control that organization. I remember after I'd been here a year, the Law School Admission Council put on a retreat in Boulder, and it was supposed to be for the faculty at all the law schools to gather and discuss issues. And I remember Norm called him up and said from Cornell, I would be coming. And I remember there was an argument that apparently they said to him, no, this is for faculty. There was some of a macho. It was not just that I was not faculty, it was also that I was a woman. And still, I was 29 when I came here, so I was still pretty young. But he just said, sorry, we're not doing it that old way anymore, and she's our person. And so I went, and I learned a lot at that, too. The Law School Admission Council grew very adept at programming for admissions professionals.
Having organized programs for admissions professionals, and what, by then they were beyond the LSAT, right? Were they doing?
Yeah, but they had just pulled away from ETS, and the Law School Admission Council was formed. That continues to be the group that makes the test, and severed its relationship with ETS. So they suddenly had a law school admissions services. They had a business arm that they were just developing. Looking back, it was really pretty exciting and very bold for them to decide to do this. Turned out to, of course, be financially a gold mine, and they made some strategically very smart decisions on how to build a reserve of the money. And I pretty quickly, I think I'd probably been here 6 years when I was on the board of LSAC. So it was a very quickly evolving organization that started to embrace women. I don't know whether they felt
moved
forced.
From the all-male sort of faculty club aspect.
Yes. And they now, of course, not only embrace women, but minorities. But the original core of male faculty members was all white. But they seem to have a real goal for diversity in law schools.
Now, your role within the school evolved, and by the end of this 37 years, you've touched student lives in virtually from before they're students here, through to their career choice,
Yeah.
their placement. Could you talk about that evolution? And
Sure, yeah. Well, you were dean when I started to be thinking, well, I actually knew I loved admissions, but I wanted to be more involved in the lives of the students than just getting them in the door. And so,
may I guess that some of them were coming to you already?
yes, they did, and I enjoyed that. Then you recall back then we had a dean of students, and when he left, you asked would I sort of become the dean of students, and I think it was about that time we decided, well, that will work if we hire a director of admissions, and that was Rick Geiger, and then that was a nice arrangement for a few years. Then I think it was really after you were back on the faculty that Al Nemeth left. He had been our placement person, and when he left, I was asked would I take over placement, and that was an ideal time to have Rick be on his own, reporting to the dean and no longer reporting to me. So I sort of shed admissions in every way, except I've stayed on the committee. Yeah, and it's interesting, as word of my retirement gets out, I've gotten a lot of nice emails, primarily from alums, and many of them are really talking about admissions. I remember when you interviewed me, and because that is a more sort of positive thing in people's mind than a lot of what the dean of students does is a kind of counseling and helping people through crises that they, I'm assuming, would just as soon forget. Although I have had some interesting messages from people whom that is how I got to know them well.
I mean, there must be people who graduated from the school who wouldn't have graduated but for the kind of support and counsel that you furnished during tough times. And
yeah, and some of them write, but more, I think if I look back, I'm saving these messages. I think if I look back through them, it's a lot of them, the connection was made at the admission stage, in part because, remember back then we did interview systematically a larger group than we have been able to do since, because we've had so many more applicants lately. And even if you tell them, oh, I'm going to report back to the committee, a lot of applicants still had the sense that they wouldn't have gotten in if I hadn't liked them, which was actually, I'm happy to say for posterity, was absolutely true. That if I met them and they seemed like a difficult, cantankerous person or whatever, I drew an arrow down on the file. That meant don't admit them. To the side meant that after half an hour of interviews, I hadn't changed my thoughts about them. And an upward arrow meant send them an admit letter. So,
it causes me to reflect that perhaps our failure to do interviews may cost us some goodwill in the long run. I mean, I'm hearing Jack Clark say that he remembers David Curtis so positively because David let him into the law school.
yeah.
David,
Well, and Al Nemeth, actually, who did several times, was called upon to be the dean of admissions before I got here. He cultivated that impression, I believe, just from hearing people's recounting. He was not afraid at all of the idea that the person thought he was picking them. And and as you and I both know, there's some very strong fans of Al's out there.
can you talk about the satisfactions of the kind of work you did, and also some of the things that you found particularly challenging?
Yeah. Well, the satisfactions, I think, are pretty easy to imagine when you're dealing basically with a group of such smart, talented young people, just being involved in their professional development is very satisfying. It was satisfying to me to cultivate a kind of technique that I felt I was being pretty fair with the difficult decisions that Dean of Students has to make. I mean, actually, to describe them, most of them are pretty small, but little things like, can you defer an exam? How sick are you? Right? You certainly don't want everybody to hear, oh, just tell her you have a cold and you can have another week to study. So, but on the other hand, you don't want to have the impression that you had favorites who you said yes to. And so little things like that, I felt like I was sort of serving the student and the institution by giving them a fair shot at all those small administrative decisions that the Dean of Students makes. I was proud of the way that almost always I was able to rationally explain the school's policies to students. And I think that sent them out the door, usually feeling like, well, she said no, but at least I understand why. I had learned from watching John Lee, who had been the Dean of Students, who for a few years reported to me. So from watching him and having students appeal his decisions to me, I learned that really the problem wasn't that he made decisions that were wrong, but that he very seldom wanted to explain to a student. So just in that sense, I thought maybe I was proud of bringing sort of a humane approach to it. I continue to feel good about the people I brought in. You remember Gihan Fernando, Karen Comstock, John DeRosa, people we have here now in really important roles. Hiring them fell into my hands, and so I feel very good about that. Bringing other people in to do a similarly good job at Cornell. And Rick Geiger, looking back, you were the dean when we hired Rick, and he's been here all these years. And but the difficulties are it might be difficult to describe this for posterity, but
let's stay away from individual cases, of
yes,
course, but
yeah, there were I think until right now, I think there were always a couple of tenured faculty who resisted sort of fully embracing the notion that the school had hired administrators to do a lot of the important work that faculty once did. And of course, every law school went through this. This law school at the moment, I think, has managed to come to an extremely comfortable place with that kind of division of labor. And I think administrators here, senior administrators, basically feel pretty good about the relationships they have with tenured faculty. But there were some difficult times with that, for me personally. It was really just with a couple of individuals, but it colored my experience.
Are you comfortable talking a bit more about that? Let me advance an observation. I mean, academia in general, and that means law schools too, are very status-conscious institutions. You've got your tenured faculty, your non-tenured but tenure track, and then you've got administrators, and then you have other staff people, and those tend to be rather clearly demarked, at least in the minds of those on top of the staff. You strike me as having almost uniquely, over your career, managed to step across that boundary and really be a colleague with many of the faculty. Do you have any advice about how to do that? Because I look at other very capable administrators in the school, and they remain largely invisible to
Well, I give the same advice to these people I've been involved with in bringing in here. And that one thing is, make it very clear that you don't want to be a faculty member. I think there's some of the status consciousness comes from some people coming in who really want to teach. And of course, if you want to teach, you want to teach at the sort of the most status-laden level, which is to be tenure track. So I never wanted to teach. It just wasn't something that I ever thought I'd be good at. So be clear to yourself that you don't want to teach, because if you do, you shouldn't take an administrative position. You'll just lead to misery. But then be clear about that with the people you're working with. But the other thing is, and I give this advice too, and I hope people will have a chance to follow it, and that is the tenured faculty at a place like this are colleagues. You know, they should be making a lot of these policy decisions in terms of what direction are we going with admissions. Are we going to shrink so we can keep our LSAT high, or, you know, all those kinds of things. I've found them terrific colleagues, but I also really believe they are the ones who should be making these policy decisions. And that if an administrator lets the school kind of put off on them these decisions, and if you don't consult with your faculty committees, you're very likely to make a misstep that then causes problems for you personally. But all these committees I've served on, the faculty have been terrific colleagues. Administrative committee, where you deal with students with individual requests for exceptions. Academic policy committee, right? Now I have, and I think the faculty on these committees with me know it. For instance, on the academic policies committee, I worked for years to get that group to recommend to the faculty raising our grades. It was clear to me running placement that ours were lower and that this was hurting our students. And so there were some faculty who were very resistant. You know, I knew who they were. They were on the committee. And I, you know, just kept coming back at them because I knew it'd never get through the faculty with an administrator simply saying, we need to do this. So, and eventually they all came around. And we came up with a proposal that passed maybe 5 years ago. It's not perfect, but it is a whole lot better than the approach we had before. So I guess I would say realize that status-wise, first in the law school is the tenured faculty, then there's the tenure track, then there's the full-time clinicians, and then there's the students, and then there's the staff. And even if your title is associate dean, you are staff. And if you can't stand that notion, you're not going to like the job.
Those who come to the institution and a range of job opportunities available to them when they graduate, not to speak of what goes on within the institution itself. Mm-hmm. Do you want to sort of reflect on those as they intersected with you and your role within the institution?
Yeah. Boy, that's a big one.
Well, and we could focus it and then move out from it. One thing I'd like to focus on are women women in the student body, women on faculty. You've already noted that when you came, many of the people with whom you interacted, both within the school and without, was a male club.
Very much.
Yeah.
There was, you've already mentioned Jane Hammond. She was a wonderful colleague to me. She was really kind. I liked her very much. But there was a tenured woman faculty member here, and she actually said I was crazy to take the job, that these men were just awful. And then when I'd been here about a year, she came to see me and said, I just don't understand it. how do you get them to go to lunch with you? You know, and it wasn't that I invited them. I just kind of tagged along. But really, I wasn't trying to. It was that people seemed to be going to lunch, and it never occurred to me that they wouldn't wish to have lunch with me. So pretty soon they got used to it, right? And so some never did, but most got completely used to it. And of course, through that, you do learn a lot about the people that you're working with. Right? But oh yeah, that gosh, looking back to those days, I mean now, there are, I don't even know the breakdown, but must be at least a third, probably more, of our full-time teachers are women.
And of course, climb in the student body too.
Yes.
And let me say that you haven't been just a passive observer of this phenomenon. I mean, you've been very much part of it, to the point that university recognized your support of women with the Cook Award. And the law school created the Anne Lukingbeal Award that now has been given, what, 15 or 16
right.
times?
Yeah, I'm not sure how many years.
The first time was to you.
Yes.
It is a way of saying to any member of the faculty or staff, you're important to the women of this institution.
Right. Yes, because there have been some men that got it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that I really appreciate. I'm still quite close to a couple of the women who were the leaders in WLC that year.
Yeah.
It was a really nice thing for them to do. The truth is, you know, when I came in '78, I think that entering class may have been a quarter women, or even maybe a little more. It wasn't. Really, Cornell had already made some very significant strides compared to our peers in terms of percent of women. I think Cornell...
Was there an active women's law coalition at that time?
Yeah. In fact, Shirley Egan, who's now been all these years in the University Council's office, she was the president of the Women's Law Coalition, and when they'd been in existence maybe 30 or 35 years, there was sort of a celebration of it, and they had some of the people like, I think, Paula Mueller, some of our very active women alumni were involved with it. Yeah, I didn't do anything to organize them. The women organized themselves, but I think instinctively back then there were a lot of questions about how do you have a full-time career and be a wife and mother, and so I was a logical person for them to ask to be on panels that they did. And then pretty quickly we had a number of, Sherry Johnson came in, Cynthia Farina, Kathy Abrams, you know, tenured faculty who also had families. In fact, I remember we very often did a program for women on how to combine. And there came a point where all of us realized that we were so fortunate that we had landed in academia, that it was almost phony for us to have this program when we knew that most of our women students would go out into big law firms, and where this kind of wonderful life we were describing, because it had flexibility, wouldn't really be an option for them. So I did start to encourage women to let's invite some women partners from these big firms, get them back, because their advice and their experiences were going to be more relevant.
Was Susan Rottfogel involved with any of the
Yes.
work?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, she was on the advisory council that first year in 1978, and I saw her again at this advisory council. She's been pretty regular attendee, but yeah, she's a real inspiration still to young lawyers, I'm sure.
Other changes?
Well, a very negative change, I think, has been imposed from without by the rankings. When I was Dean of Admissions, sure, you wanted to bring in a class with a high median LSAT, but it wasn't the be-all and end-all. And I remember when you were Dean, talking to you about some applicants at the end of the summer whom I really wanted to bring in, who obviously were smart, but whose credentials were somehow they're slightly flawed, and we almost always brought them in, I don't remember ever being burned by finding some of those sort of gems whose numerical credentials weren't quite what we were looking for. Now there's such pressure to be
When did
sure.
that pressure take off? U.S. News started its rankings, what, early 90s, something like that?
Well,
Or was
I think
was it earlier than
Rick came on board with us about 87, and he became the dean of admissions around 90. And I always felt, looking back, that I never bore the pressures that he has to make sure these numbers stay up. So I think that's had very negative consequences on who we're able to bring in here. Although it's almost imaginary, because how do we know? But it also makes interviews of less value, really. If you interview a fabulous person whose LSAT is 5 points lower than the mean, and you love them, you still might decide not to admit them. So it's provided an artificial structure to admissions that I think impacts on who we actually have here. They're younger, much, we're not, the number over 30 when they come in is a much smaller group than it was back in the 80s. I think the cost of legal education has had a very negative impact. I remember in maybe the mid-'80s, I wrote an article for the forum that was called Admitting Our Successes, but it talked about my concerns about tuition. And I just I said our tuition's $15,000 now. Who will be able to come when it's $25,000? Well, of course, now it's $60,000 or close. So, I think that really has had a negative impact on legal education, not just here, but the kind of person.
Compared to peers, are we able to furnish roughly the same amount of support to offset that tuition to the scholarships?
Well, see that word peers? Depends on what you mean by that. Because we like to think of ourselves as having as peers even Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. And I believe they financially are in a very different world than we are.
So let's redefine peers as those that students are, prospective students are comparing.
Yeah,
Cornell.
which is probably more like UCLA, Georgetown, possibly even Vanderbilt and WashU. Yeah, so, I've seen the statistics, as I'm sure you have, of endowment per student. And so I think our ability to fund student aid pretty well tracks our ranking in endowment per student. So we probably do a little better than Georgetown, but not as good as Penn or Northwestern, just because they have more money. But I'd say we're holding our own. I don't think we're slipping in that regard.
What about on the output side? Back when you took the job, the real takeoff of big law salaries had not yet occurred.
Right.
And then that happened, and it didn't just happen once, but it continued to accelerate to the point that there's now this huge chasm between what you can get with a large law firm and what you would get in the public interest sector. That surely has affected the career choices that students make and the kind of measures the school has been prompted to make to support those who want to make a less remunerative career choice.
Right.
You want to talk about that?
I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah.
The truth is, over time, I think individual applicants have become much more consumers. They do a lot of research, et cetera, about their options. And so I think the vast majority of people coming here now pick us because we have continued to be really good at placing people in these big, high-paying firms. So I don't really think that we are attracting very many people who from the get-go want a public service career. I think some of our students eventually want a public career, but their motivation in coming to Cornell and what they want initially is a large private firm. And even with the downturn in the job market, I think 5 or 6 years ago, we've continued to be really good at that. But because of their consumer mentality, the students who don't get it, I mean, 98% of our students go to that August job fair. And it's sort of getting higher and higher. Used to be there were maybe 5-6% who just didn't want it. So it creates a haves and have-nots in the student body that I think is really hard on students. Because if you wanted those jobs, if you don't have such a job, by October of your second year, your chances of graduating and going into that market are really slim. Because meanwhile, employers' behaviors become much more sort of paralyzed. They only want to take people that were in their summer program. They don't like to hire 3Ls that they haven't worked with. So we, currently are dealing with 20 to 25% of our students who didn't get the big firm. Most of them are pretty unhappy about it. There may be, of that group, there may be a third of them who aren't unhappy at all because they never wanted it. And we do offer them a lot with Karen Comstock and Liz Peck. And you started, we were one of the first law schools to have one of these post-graduation plans where we tried to help people who got jobs in the public sector. We had tried to help them pay their debt so they could take the job. And so that was a long time ago. And we were really one of the first law schools in the country to have it. It wasn't very big. It's now grown, and the amount of assistance we give is more. But I don't know if it's a generational thing with the young people these days, or maybe we would have been this way too. But when it's $160,000 to go work for these private law firms, and maybe 50 or 60 to work in the public interest.
And you've been paying close to 60 in tuition.
Exactly. Even with, and the government now has a couple of assistance programs for one's income based, just based on educated people with debt who don't have a high income. But there's also a public interest one that the government runs. And I don't mean to be sniffing at them, they're well worth using, as is our plan, but it still leaves a huge income gap. And I guess in this country, I think an awful lot of people, part of what you think of what work you're doing is how much are you paid. So those are changes that I think are sort of negative changes. Positive changes would be how many more people from families where even college was not part of their picture are now coming to law school, and are coming to law schools like this. I don't have any data, but it seems to me that lots of our students now, when you say, so where are you getting your ideas about what lawyers do? The answer is, oh, well, I certainly don't know any. And I think, to me, that's a real positive, because I think we certainly can educate them to be really good professionals, even though it wasn't part of their family makeup. So to me, that's a real plus.
Ethnic diversity, international?
Ethnic obviously has grown incredibly. And certain areas of it. My first year here, I remember working with the lone Asian student, and I know him, I still know him. He was Asian American. He wasn't an international student. And I gave him the names of all the Asian students that we admitted, and his plan was to call them and get them to come here. And maybe I gave him 10 names or something. And he called them all and came in devastated because they were all going to Harvard. The pool was just so small. And now, of course, I think coming in the door, typically about 20% of the student body is either from Asia or is Asian American, which is just really amazing, that change. Balsa has always been a struggle to keep the numbers up, but we're way above where we were 25 or 30 years ago in terms of consistently bringing in probably somewhere between 10 and 20. I don't know that we've ever brought in more than 20 into one JD class, but that's but we have to keep working at it. It's not. And then with Hispanics, that number also is just really grown in terms of national applicant pool, but also in terms of Cornell's ability to attract. So LALSA is one of our most vital student organizations. It's phenomenal what the things they do.
Any observations on your involvement with national bodies? In other words, you've been involved with LSAC, with ALS, with ABA accreditation. Did I say NALP?
NALP, yes. Yeah, I think I'm very grateful that I never sensed resistance from any dean, and I probably worked with, if I counted acting deans, 6 or 7. Never any resistance to the idea that I wanted to spend some time working with these groups. And the school does get back a little something from it in terms of more expertise in the administrator, but it also means you're gone some. So it probably kept me really loving the job in a way that if those groups didn't exist, I might have been looking around for something else.
Furnishes your colleagues too, who are doing. I mean, you can talk about similar issues.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and with the NALP board, that was a group where they really made me feel that I was a mentor for them. Many of the NALPers are either at law firms as sort of the recruiting director. They're often not lawyers, often in a very hierarchical employment situation where people aren't spending a lot of time explaining why law schools behave the way they do, et cetera. So with that NALP board, I think it was only 2 years, but it might have been 3. That was a lot of fun about that.
We probably ought to explain what NALP stands
for. National Association of Law Placement. And it's half all law schools belong, and then maybe 2,000 law firms. So it's dominated by law firms, but there's a balance of power established that gives law schools an equal amount of power within the organization. But the one that was really the kind of most wonderful of all of those boards was the ABA Accreditation Committee, which I just rolled off of. It's a 6-year term. And it's 19 people. By regulation, only half can be from law schools. The other half are primarily judges, and there's a couple of public members who cannot be lawyers. But where they find this is such a congenial group, and a lot of hard work. This is my first year not doing it for 6 years, and it's sort of like, whoa, I had no idea.
Where did all this time come from?
I got my weekends back, right? Because so much of it was what you're doing is monitoring the 200 ABA-approved law schools and ensuring that they're meeting the ABA accreditation standards. And the government's gotten very involved in forcing equal treatment. You know, the fanciest law school in the country has to be held to the same standards as the brand new small one. And but it meets 5 times a year for 3-day meetings. But being in Ithaca, that really means being gone 5 days, 5 times a year. So it was a lot of work, but I learned a tremendous amount. But really, it was just a wonderful group of colleagues from all kinds of places. You know who was? Might not have told you this. Dan Freeling, who was associate director of our law library when I first came. Well, first was Bob Oakley.
Right.
But then was Dan. He was the
Consultant.
deputy consultant on the ABA. And he's actually the person who said, Anne, I think you want to retire to Asheville. He heard me talking about what I was looking for. And I said, I've never been. And based on his recommendation, went and checked it out, and that is where we're going.
I'm at the point where I'm going to ask whether there's anything else that we should be talking about, and it could include what lies ahead.
Well, I'm moving to Asheville on April 1, no matter what we've managed to do in terms of hiring a new dean of students. But I'm not going to leave the school in the lurch. I'm happy to try to do the job by Skype and maybe an occasional visit until we bring somebody new in. We're making some progress on that front. I'm moving down there and just really looking forward to being young enough to try to establish new roots in a place where I don't have any. I think the weather's a lot better.
Are you going to break sort of loose of legal education? Or?
Well, actually, I don't think I want to. And so the ABA has indicated interest in would I like to be one of the people they refer, when somebody wants to hire a consultant. For the last 6 years, I have not done any consulting because it was sort of a conflict with being on the committee. But so I think I would really enjoy that. I've done a little consulting before I got on that accreditation committee and loved it. But so I assume I would continue to enjoy it, but I wouldn't want it to turn into a full-time job because I'm planning to learn to speak Spanish. UNC Asheville is a liberal arts college that encourages citizens for a very inexpensive price to take courses. So I'm going to sign up for Spanish 101, and I'm going to get a new puppy. I think it'll be easier to train the puppy, not working full time, and trying to. But other than that, I'm hoping to sort of be able to do a lot of hiking and the puppy. My plan is to train the dog to be a companion dog, and be able to take the dog into hospitals and nursing homes. In Nelson's various hospitalizations, we've had people bring companion dogs in and say, would you like to meet our dog? And it was remarkable how much it raises people's spirits. So that I got the idea that I think that's the kind of thing I'd like to do in retirement.
Great.
So I'll give it a shot. My grandkids are getting older, so I hope to spend time with them. They're 14, 13, and almost 11. So that's a plan too.
All right.
Yeah, but yeah, no. Just in with hindsight, I think I've already put on the rose-colored glasses, and feel like I just serendipity just lucked into stepping into this place all those years ago, because it's felt like an extremely good fit in all these different roles that I've had in student affairs. And when I started out graduating from law school, I had no idea there were careers like this to be had, and never imagined it. So I feel extremely lucky, and I hope I don't, within a month or two, think, oh my goodness, I made a horrible mistake, because I still feel capable of doing it. It's not that old age is driving me out, but I do think it's a good time to maybe veer off in a different direction and try retirement at least.
No, I'll simply observe that serendipity worked both ways.
Yeah.
That it
Yeah,
was the
probably did.
remarkable good fortune of this
Probably
institution
did.
that you
Yeah.
stepped through the door in '78.
Yeah, for me it was just
Yeah,
good luck. You know, one thing I do regret about in my life is I never occurred to me to apply to Cornell Law School. I'm not sure I really focused on the fact there was, because if I'd known and thought about it, it would have been a place that I probably would have liked to have gone.
Oh,
But
great.
such is life.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been fun.
Good.